We've got, this nuclear reaction happening in the middle of nowhere, but this thing sends out waves or particles or something, and then it hits this little thing that we're living on, and this energy goes spraying around everywhere. And somehow these things that we call human beings take a little spectrum of that energy and converts it in a brain into a thing that we call color. And not only do we do that, the amazing process of taking pure energy and then converting it in our eyes to electrical energy and going to our brain almost instantaneously and disseminating it and reanalyzing it and putting it all back together, and then we say, "Ooh, isn't that beautiful?" or "Boy, that apple looks good to eat." The process is just so phenomenally grand. The reason I keep sticking with the seemingly simplistic world of color relationships and the magic that can happen in color is I think it's a profound point and a profound observation of one's existence.
I've known Lucas for about 30 years now, I guess. We were introduced because we were both showing at the same gallery in Monterey, and I was immediately struck with his intellectual knowledge of the painting process and the use of color. Lucas took the history of color painting, of painting, and one piece at a time he was stripping away all of the crutches that were inherent in painting, such as, let's start with just representational painting. He took away the representation. There was no longer a landscape or a still life. He reduced it down to very simple forms, just plain rectangles on a plain background. But the effect was not that. That wasn't his purpose, just to strip it away. He was trying to get down to the bare emotions that you could achieve through the use of color. This was a long process for him. It's a very contemplative, very time-consuming process that he goes through in order to be able to produce a painting. He's bringing something that would normally be not have that much importance and elevating it to this tremendously spiritual, strong piece of work that can change your way of looking at the world. And what he does with his work is to make the viewer an active participant in creating the work. So what appears at first to be maybe 4 rectangles on a plain background is not that at all. What it is that is the foundation upon which your mind creates a whole series of other objects and shapes because of the persistence of color, where your eyes can't concentrate on a line where 2 colors intersect if they're in any way complementary. That line won't resolve itself. It has to vibrate, it has to move, and it has to create another color, another shape. So while you might look at that simple rectangle, let's say a green rectangle on an orange background, after a little while, suddenly there's purples and yellows coming out in between those rectangles or laid into the center of the rectangles. And the rectangle itself suddenly has a bright green or bright orange background, or a red or purple background will suddenly flash, and the colors will switch from one color to another. You just have to spend enough time with the work to see this happening. You can get an immediate reaction. It may only take a minute or two to have colors start to dance across the canvas. But that's only the first stage. Suddenly there's colors flashing, there's rhythms that are built up, there's movement going across the canvas, up and down, vertically, horizontally, colors that suddenly just reverse themselves on the canvas. And that's something you have to spend some time to be able to see, and it's exciting when you do.
There was a certain time when I was sort of in a stage where I wanted to find some new things, and I was finding more difficulties with colors and more interesting colors, actually. But then I think somewhere in the late 70s, I happened to see an exhibit at the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, which was a collection of Amish quilts, and not the Mennonite types that were sort of kaleidoscopic. These were very fundamental, simple, 4-bar or 5-bar, basically 2 to 3 colors, most of them. and yet they had this incredible power. You know, these were done by women who were not allowed to have any sort of egocentric, egotistic experiences in life. That was sort of not accepted in that community. And it seems by reducing their will for pleasure, it squeezed its way out through the choices they made in the materials that they used for these quilts. And the subtleties of color radiated, and it was almost as if this was the only outlet they had, and they were very powerful. A few of them were very bright and contrasty, but a lot of them were very subtle. In fact, some of them were 2 or 3 colors of very similar appearing colors, and then they would start interreacting and reacting. And I was quite fascinated by that. And that's part of the reason where part of what I use as well for my design. I oftentimes use 4 bars, 5 bars, and it's basically connected to that as a design steel, if that's the word. But I found it's the simplest form to work with. And verticality has a certain stimulation, and horizontality has a certain stimulation. So I work with those as a combination. But that sort of started me off with having some courage to just do simple monochromatic colors, or very similar colors working together with each other, and simple canvases and simple designs. And I think I've sort of held on to that a bit. The design is really not that important. It's trying to find the actual experience that happens with the colors and how they work together and how they develop a sense of composition out of experience rather than out of structure. And so my colors started becoming more subdued and more closely related. And that really started me on the journey of trying to find out what is there and what can be developed in that. And I think there is a tremendous power in there somewhere. I think there's a tremendous sense of the sacred, if that's the word to use. The earlier work was sort of black and white with color on top of it. Then the colors became grays and blue grays because of the Amish stuff. The ones that I was fascinated most were the ones that were very subtle browns and reds, and that would sort of just glow in a very stately way. My own colors, I kept holding on to that for a long time as well. I think over the years I've gotten a tendency to become brighter and more clear with the color because I sort of got addicted to the whole pleasure aspect of it myself. I mean, I enjoy the power that you can build the color, and I came to a point where I decided I wanted to have a work that was like a piece of theater. It's confrontive in terms of, I wanted it to be an entertainment, and I wanted it to be or have a sense of depth about it. So I started creating composition, I think, where there's that introduction, there's the splash, and then there's the secondary stuff that starts to happen. And hopefully then also the subtlety comes out that used to come out of those simple subdued colors. But now it comes out of a process that's a little longer term, a little bit more time involved rather than just that black on black kind of concept, which I think some of the earlier work I had was a little bit more subdued and more quiet, more reflective in a way. Now the newer work became much more theatrical. The colors stand out, they come at you. The earlier work kind of said, this is about you as a viewer coming up to something and taking some time and seeing what it means to you, or what do you see in that piece. And then there's a lot of subjective kind of work put into it. When now I think my more current work and what I've been striving to do is that there's no doubt when someone walks up to my paintings now that it's happening. There's no second guessing. It's alive. I mean, it has a sense of movement. It has a sense of change. It doesn't look static in any way. And I think some of the earlier work had the quality of being static, and as you stared at it, you might start to see different things in it. Now it's just happening. And I'm much more pleased with that approach. I don't think I really started painting until I was in my late teens, early 20s. Before then, I was very much involved with line work. I was doing pen and ink drawings, part of probably growing up in San Francisco Bay Area in the 60s. I then went to school and got into the drawing classes and got into the painting classes, and somewhere along the line I got into a more advanced painting class where one had to paint their own stuff as they saw it at the time. And so I had to really kind of scrape and figure out what would I want to paint. And the first painting I did actually was rectangles and some amorphous backgrounds, but you can see the connection at the time. And for some reason, I think that has some sort of relative to being Dutch. I grew up with very post-war Holland, a lot of modernist architecture, minimalist kind of approaches to things. When I was about 4 or 5, I went to a Montessori school where the project for the half a year was to make bookshelves, and they were all rectangles, and they were either black or they were white. It was definitely a style kind of approach to life. And that was, I think, an influence underneath it all. Having been an immigrant, there were language issues and cultural issues. I think when I started working, I sort of fell back to the earlier life experience things I'd grown up with, shapes and forms, and I definitely kept working with illusions of line work and rectilinear type compositions. For a while, through the 70s, I kind of started working with sort of amorphous cloud-like imagery, using lines to distort those images, trying to still create effects, and following the line of basically presenting imagery to an audience that allowed them to see what happened via their own process. I started doing small line type compositions where lines were related to other lines, and I noticed how the color was changing. There were some issues that had to be overcome. Number one, when you start just dealing with color, there are a lot of other artists who've created the conversation earlier and who have ways of doing it that are very similar in terms of design and color, shapes, types of colors. So I had to get over the Rothko phase where I was doing kind of soft edge work and almost landscape steps, which gave the impression of Rothko, but the effect of the color was different. Not nearly as painterly. In fact, I call myself a painter, but really I don't follow in the painter's tradition whatsoever. It's much more about using paint, but the goal really is to create the color experience. Somewhere in the 80s, I think I moved to San Francisco, and I had been doing very flat kind of canvases that were basically little rectangles and all sort of looked like a one monochromatic color that started to sort of vibrate. Robert Hughes, who said, at what point does the void become nothing? You know, and it was sort of edging on that, I felt. So I basically took what I was doing in a chunk of it and just blew it up and ended up with these rectangles and spray bars and much more compositions made out of pieces rather than just sort of a wall of color. God, Bridget Riley, you know, was kind of an op artist that I had a good time with, and I still enjoy some of her pieces, or a lot of her work. A person I kept bumping into for many years as I was doing my own work and then would walk into a museum and see work that had a connection was Agnes Martin. Jeff Becom, of course, I'm a fan. People like Frank Stella were interesting to me, and I think it was more because of architectural reasons. I, of course, was crazy about Rothko, but it's not what I paint. You know, he was discussing the whole abstract expressionist concept of trying to communicate through what you feel and then applying it on the canvas, and then somehow the viewer gets that same experience, or that there was a communication that happened. I try to work in a communication and a universality that we all have color experience, but I'm not looking to express my personal journey so much as I'm trying to create a universal experience. Where do you start when you start talking about the progression of the work? It is always a learning experience, and in your 20s you have all these great ideas and you keep exploring all sorts of things and you want to express stuff. After a while, things just become more acceptable. I remember I was trying to figure out how to do color when I finally came to that point where I felt color was the issue I wanted to discuss, and how to present it. Because the problem is you have the Amish quilts. They've been done, they're beautiful, and they make a statement in themselves. Do I start making quilts? You know, should I paint? Then when I decided, well, I paint, that's what I do, so let's just assume that that's the way I have to do it. Should I use a brush? Should I spray? I decided it was better to spray because spraying meant the color was the issue, not the painting. Then the shapes. I had always worked with rectangles somewhere along the line from the earliest work I did to today. And so I've just said that's one of my tools. One knows it's a Lucas Blok when they see a Lucas Blok, not for the sake that it's a Lucas Blok, but for the sake that they look anew at the work rather than dismissing it or categorizing it. You know, when you categorize, you stop looking. The idea is to try and stay as open as possible. And so the tools have remained the same. It's just by using and having more understanding of how the colors are going to work or how I want them to work, I can manipulate and set myself up a little bit more clearly and come up with compositions that in some ways seem more complex, but in other ways are more direct and more simple in a way. They happen more easily. They're not so studied in terms of the viewer. They're more studied from my perspective, but I hope and I try to work in such a way that I keep the design fairly simple. It's usually fairly simple numbers of colors, no more than 8 or 9, not intentionally, but it seems to be enough. And I always try to just have enough color in there that everything happens, but not enough color to make it a pattern or design and feel like I'm in control. There's some paintings I remember I did where I would get to a point in a painting and I would start to see shadow images and colors happening in the painting, and I would actually start to paint those colors. Because I thought, oh, that's what I see in the painting. Now, how can I bring that out more? And there was a point where I finally said, now, wait a minute. I don't have to paint those colors. I make those colors by looking at the painting. So why not allow the viewer to make those colors? I don't have to paint them. So actually, there were some paintings that were more complicated in terms of the actual physical imagery on the canvas than today's paintings have. But there's still a lot going on, and that's really because I've been able to highlight or make clear the color activity that the viewer sort of has happen or that I see happening in the painting. Everything is about discovery ultimately in the process of creating a painting, but I think my earlier work was less, I worked from a less knowledgeable point. I was sort of bumping into things and finding things, and I really did enjoy the mystery of discovery. There's knowledge you get and you develop a vocabulary. I've developed a vocabulary in what I like to do, or where I can see that problems might arise, or I can pre-visualize what might happen and what can happen. And I find now I'm a little bit more planned. I have to be, because the technical issues of spraying paint and acrylic paint and its transparencies and issues like that, I can't make too many mistakes without having to destroy the painting. So there's a little bit of control that has to happen. But I usually try to set it up so I can put myself from zero, a white canvas, which I build in gesso, and I'm thinking about the shape as I'm going and trying to visualize what I might be able to put on the canvas. I usually come to a point where I can take it to stage 2, which is a very fundamental structure of the painting, which allows me to sort of stand in front of an 8-foot or 10-foot painting and look at it and start to see what's happening with the painting and then develop it farther. And the discoveries happen more near the end, where the painting starts to all of a sudden take on a life or a sense that is new to me. My real pleasure is coming to a point that I haven't been at before, and that usually leads on to the next painting. Well, usually the visualizations that I see in my head aren't compositions that will work per se. They'll get me to a certain point, but I know enough now to say, no, that won't work. You know, even myself, I find there are color combinations and color arrangements that I think are attractive. You know, that's a nice design, or that's an attractive sense of color grouping. But then I realize, yeah, but that's not going to make that secondary color thing happen. It's not going to bring out that complexity of experience. It'll just look very beautiful. You know, like an Baer's. It's beautiful color harmony. They just exist. They float in space almost. And I have that happen sometimes in paintings, and I've gone in that direction, and I'm not always happy with that. I'm happier to try and create stimulus that makes the painting seem more kinetic than something out of an Baer's or an Ad Reinhardt. So what I visualize when I'm trying to think of a painting, I work it. I mean, I'll see something, or something will grab me, or I'll be thinking about the painting that I'm working on, and I can project it onto my frontal lobe. And then I can start to manipulate it. And then I can use intellect actually to try and modify it. And then I'll go back to the canvas and try and apply some of those ideas. And as I say, there's a certain point where you have to just let go and realize it's not going to turn out the way you thought it was going to be. It's just you need kicks to make yourself go to the next step. I'm working on a piece right now that I got 3 colors on the canvas and said, it's dead. What's going on here? It should be happening, and yet it's not. And it's because the right combination hadn't occurred yet. Not that I was wrong in anything, but I needed to provide another color to create a contrast that would allow the color experiences to be happening in the ones that are already there. as one is painting, it's like I said, it's like going for a walk. One walks into the forest, and it's beautiful. I mean, I live in an area that's very beautiful, and one can breathe that in and say it's absolutely delightful and it's a beautiful experience. But then there are those key moments when, as if you were walking in a forest and suddenly you see an animal like a deer just between the trees. You're just able to spot it. You haven't necessarily been aware that it's there, and there's a shift that happens mentally in that experience. And I find that's the same thing with creating a painting. Is there's a point of discovery or point of realizing something's there that under normal circumstances I wouldn't be aware of, or it's only the process that has allowed me to see that or feel that. I've tried to develop my way of painting or putting these pieces together where I have various levels of interest. I use very simple shapes, so it's very easy to get people to just walk away or walk by it. So what I've tried to do is create levels of the painting whereby the painting has an initial introductory phase. It has scale, it has immediacy in terms of the first colors that come forth, oftentimes very strong relationships and complementaries and very confident shapes. And those are very intentionally done to basically grab the attention of the viewer and hold them long enough that subsequently the secondary visual experience starts to have with the painting. Because the paintings are really about the viewer's experience with the painting. There's really an attempt to establish a confrontation and then to develop an environment where the person looking at a piece really sort of discovers their own experience as they're viewing the piece. They start to see color flashes, colors coming and going, colors disappearing, the color quality of the color changing, the tone actually changing a little bit. There are residual color effects. Then thirdly, of course, which I think is one of the crucial parts and the whole point to it, is that I tried to find that other spot that has some sort of emotional context. I don't think we're all the same, but I think there is a commonality that color does have an emotional context and an emotional connection in a non-narrative, much like music. Music is one of the great abstractions. I mean, it has no association with anything that we know of consciously, and yet it has some tremendous power to make one feel emotional and have an emotional experience, as well as even further than that, some sort of cathartic experience. And it is my intention and my work that tries to recreate that experience in a visual effect. So there's no association with imagery, there's no association with colors. I really do try to create colors that don't exist normally in this world. I try to make colors that are, of course, very plastic, that change, that alternate, that become something else, that flash, that create secondary imagery. And it's all part of this composition of, similar to music, but rather than time being a linear factor like music has rhythm, I try to create the rhythm in the pulsing and the quality of the painting and the introduction that makes that sort of rhythm happen. Early on, even when I don't think I was really developed as a painter at all, or just a student barely, I became enamored and became married to a wonderful musician, Barbara Ruzicka. She was a classical pianist. And I started realizing or learning as a listener such of the wonderful things about the whole process of creating piano music. And I sort of grew to enjoy it more and more. And I think I've tried to have that sort of thing work with the painting as well. I think music is abstraction in an ultimate sense, but it's also inherently human. It's the experience of human beings taking sensory experiences and through the process of all of that, coming up with something that's, in their opinion, beautiful, emotional. It brings up some of the most noble aspects of the human experience. And that's all out of a non-word-based structure that's just purely sensory. I don't know if color quite operates the same way, but I think there's a reason human beings create color out of light. You know, it's a way to see energy, but we attach value to it. The Impressionists, starting with Cezanne, I think he's sort of the granddaddy of it all. Painting not to render something, but to try and recreate the sense of being with something. So his paintings seem to be collections of sensations. In fact, he used the term small sensations to reference how he applied his painting techniques. And you see that really amplified when you get into the post-impressionists, where people like Van Gogh and Seurat really worked to try and heighten the strength of color. The 20th century, early 20th century saw the big change that paintings actually became paintings and were important as paintings rather than paintings of something. And color was a big part of that, and color became color as its own experience, and it existed and was to be celebrated through the works of Kandinsky and so forth. In my own work, I kind of have found that there's some sense of real emotional experience that happens in a very simplified, unrepresentational way of presenting color. I think that sort of came out of the 60s, that non-representational painting, abstract painting, allowed for the pure experience of the piece that it was confrontive. It wasn't so much a narrative of something that had happened in history that we all agreed upon. It was more like it was an individual, personal experience. I think I sort of found that over the years that color in itself could do that without any sort of design issue so much as purely getting colors to relate to each other and creating a vibratory effect, which hopefully also inspired the other experiences of emotions and elation, the whole host of human experience. A lot of people don't see color. They take it for granted. It's just kind of there. And my paintings have a tendency to, for a lot of people, they walk up to them and they just see them as billboards. There's 4 bars of blue, let's say, in a red background, and they walk on. I mean, that's the challenge I have, is how do I get people who see 4 blue bars on a red background to stop and realize that around the blue bars, the whole thing is starting to shift to orange. And as the shifting is happening from the orange, the blue bars start to dance around in a circle, or as your eyes are moving across the canvas, the blue is following them, and there's a pattern being created by those blue bars. And the red is starting to change color. It's either shifting towards a purple or it's becoming an orange here or there. And then there are secondary things that start to develop. So, you know, that's my challenge, is how to get people to see that. I mean, there are color theories that occur and that everybody has documented. It's a very common understanding when you go to art school that if you put blue on top of red, you're going to see some sort of residual color effects. There are very basic rules like that with complementary colors and what happens when you lay them side by side. And so you find if you put a purple bar on top of an orange background, the purple bar becomes a blue-green bar. And it's no longer the color that you saw in the tube or in the jar. And so that offers up all kinds of possibilities, because once I establish that that's not correct, then it opens the door that then I can start using colors that aren't real complementaries but appear to be complementaries. And it offers a vocabulary of playing with those colors. I work generally with larger pieces. And the reason I do that is pure pleasure, because scale offers such a wonderful opportunity to really make the work environmental rather than a framed composition, which I think with smaller pieces there's a tendency for the eye to be able to capture it in one shot, while larger pieces force the eye and the head to move. And part of the whole reaction with color is the movement of the eye. And if I can get the body to also move, it means the experience of the painting becomes more involved and more complex, and it gives me room to move. And I also think it's just more pleasurable. I mean, it's a sense of being somewhere. It's more confrontive. It takes over. It's not an intellectual pursuit of color. It literally becomes an environment of color. The viewer gets to basically stand there and look at a piece that's not an illusion, but it's a confrontation whereby they start to observe their own process of creating that color experience. Now, I've worked with Jeff Becom when we had an exhibit in 1999 at the Monterey Museum of Art, because our work had some similarities in terms of color. And we had my paintings, of course, and Jeff had his photography. And we also created an installation where we took Jeff's background in architectural contexts, as well as his understanding of color, and myself, and we basically created an environment of color, which was kind of an interesting way of working, where the rectilinear quality of the architecture created compositions that might have been found here and there in my paintings or in just photographs, but they were environments where people were actually standing in the middle of it. So a lot of the color experiences were actually three-dimensional. We called the piece, not necessarily connected to a Rothko, it's a color chapel, because I think we both felt that there was a sense that It was a unique place to be. It had a sense of real personal experience and power. I think there was a power in the piece, actually. The exhibit at the Museum of Design, Art and Architecture in Culver City in 2007, I think it was a great opportunity for me because it's a marvelous architectural space. It's high ceilinged, large walls, and marvelous people who control what happens there and were willing and allowed me to do whatever I wanted for that particular exhibit. I've wanted to work much larger than I generally do, which means pieces that are not normally intended for a home or an office building, but something that's much more connected to like exhibition spaces as in museums. And so in this exhibit, I really simplified the presentation of the paintings. I did large paintings. There were 6 walls. I did 6 paintings. I tried to create a bit of variety in the style or the content of the paintings to try and present different emotional and color presentations in the pieces. The newest work is really more about a composition of wave, of effect. It isn't so much that there are 4 bars, except I use 4 bars, but what happens with the painting, there's a sense of it's just vibrating all the time. It's less object-oriented, but more wave-oriented. They're on, they're happening. The light is on, the stereo's on, whatever. There's a sense of as you walk up to a painting, it's happening. The reason I keep sticking with the simplicity or what seemingly simplistic world of color relationships and the magic that can happen in color is I think it's a profound point and a profound observation of one's existence and the celebration of that, and trying to explore in each piece that process and remind people of that incredible grandness of their experience and how incredibly profound that is, and to celebrate it. I mean, I really do hope, and I think it happens, that when people see my paintings, hopefully when they walk outside, they see outside a little differently. Yeah, why not end with Cezanne when it sort of began with Cezanne in many ways? When I was a student, Cezanne always came up, and I always thought, oh yeah, Cezanne, yes, he's the father of Impressionism. And you take that as kind of a historical context. But the more I've bumped into stories of Cezanne, you realize he's really quite a model for the artist's life and the colorist's life. His goal wasn't to live in Paris. His goal was to live in the South, where his father had property that he inherited with his sisters, and he could just spend his days going out and looking at the world and thinking about what it meant to paint it and what painting was and what was going on with a painting. And he didn't really want to paint southern France to make it look like a nice painting of southern France. He really wanted, and this subsequently became associated with Impressionism, he really wanted to create a piece of work that upon walking up to it, one had the sensations that one might get from standing in southern France. That the painting no longer was about something else, but that the painting itself had its own power. And the way he wanted to do that, the way he saw of doing that, was to create a painting which was a collection of sensations, of little thrills and little experiences as one looked at the painting, not in a narrative, but as a visual stimulation. And so the colors they kind of vibrate, and if you look at how he did the colors on the trees and the branches, you get a sensation that they're fluttering. They're not a tree, like Marguerite, this is not a pipe. Cezanne wasn't saying this is not a tree, he was just saying, this is a sensation. Doesn't it remind you, or do you have that feel that you might get from a tree? I mean, that's real abstract. That's really taking, instead of talking about Saint Marco or Saint this and trying to manifest the religious concepts, he was really saying, pay attention, wake up. Which there was a sort of a meld into the Eastern, which also brings us back to oftentimes color theory, which is through the history of Western civilization, color has often been associated as being Eastern. Buddhism, Hinduism, and the aspects of being awake. I think all the art forms for the artist is a way of experiencing life, and putting yourself in front of a blank canvas and taking that whatever journey trip is part of the whole high and the reason you keep doing it. It's the only thing you know. It's the only reason to keep doing it. There's no long-term vision about where that's going to go. As far as I know, I'm not unhappy yet with the mysteries that I keep bumping into, and I'm not unhappy with the solutions that come out. I feel there's a long way to go yet on that. I don't feel like I've worn out the process.